And hello, welcome to the ASP.NET Community Stand-Up. I'm happy to be joined by Sebastien Ros today, and we're going to be talking about output caching on .NET 7, which is pretty exciting. So I'll just say a quick hi. I'm John Galloway. I'm a PM on the .NET Community team. And then Sebastien, can you introduce or explain what you do?
I wonder myself what I'm doing, but I'm Sebastien Ros, and I work in the ASP.NET team as a dev, and I work on so many things. It depends on the day. So today it's output caching. Yesterday was benchmarking, and tomorrow, who knows?
We've had you on several times in the past. You've also talked about Orchard Core and a lot of the things you do there. Recently, you were on talking about localization on the .NET website. You helped with that.
True. You see, I don't know what I'm doing tomorrow.
Tons of stuff. And you're not talking about benchmarking today, but you've been on a lot of the time in the past. You've talked about Crank and some of the things going on there.
Not benchmarking, but it's related to performance actually, because the goal of output caching is also to make things faster, if not the main thing. Well, resource management.
There you go. All right. Well, as always, we're going to start with some community links. I just have a few today, so I'm going to share the links in the chat. And they're also listed in the show description if you're watching this later. And they are here at this URList link. So there's a lot of ways you can find them. And I will go ahead and share my screen. Yeah, so just a few today. It's kind of it feels like it's that kind of part of the cycle. .NET 6 came out in November. We had kind of a rush of, hey, .NET 6 is out. Here's all the new stuff. And then we've got, kind of beginning on the .NET 7 planning. Some of the features and previews are starting to roll out, but not a huge amount of stuff, public right now. So here's what we got. First of all, this is pretty neat. This is Tom Dyson. He does a ton of cool stuff. And this is a global .NET global tool that will build an image from a project. So, quick install, .NET tool install, and then here he creates a console application, and then he just does .NET build image. So you can see right there. and then that automatically is going to generate a Docker file. It actually does this using layers. So it uses a build image and a release image, so that the release image that it publishes to is, relatively small. There's already kind of people commenting on, hey, could you do this for caching and some other things. But this is a very quick way to get something up and running. So pretty neat. I have to say also, I enjoyed just kind of browsing through the code. It's a global tool. It's built using system command line, automating reading in project files and creating Docker files and things like that. And I just, I don't know, it was beautiful code. I liked looking at his code. So.
If you know Tom, you just trust him and understand that whatever he does is great. So I don't know what he's doing, but it must be good.
This is what he's doing this week, but I agree. He's constantly doing cool stuff. So that's quite an endorsement. All right. This is pretty neat. This is from Tim, and he pinged me about this. This is kind of in the same sort of feeling as the Instant APIs project that we had on recently with Chris Noring and Jeff Fritz. And theirs builds APIs based on inspecting an EF model or a JSON file. So you can say, here's my EF model, build me an API for it. This builds APIs based on defining things. Here he's got an iObject base. And so it'll kind of inspect your project, and it'll build APIs based on that. So it's kind of interesting seeing what people are building on top of the minimal API APIs. Here he's got a short video looking at that. So already, a good amount of people kind of checking it out and taking a look. So he told me he's interested in people, contributing and giving some feedback as he starts to build it. All right, just a few more. This is just, I've been using GitHub Copilot for a while. So it's just now available in Visual Studio publicly, and I've been using it in VS Code as well. So, it's pretty easy to install. And then another nice thing is he shows that there's ways that you can enable or disable it in specific places. Sometimes it's very helpful. Sometimes it gets in the way. So it's very easy to configure that, in a project or file type or something. Have you used GitHub Copilot much, Sebastien?
Well, I don't think I have.
It's kind of like, sometimes it's ridiculously off, but most of the time it's kind of scary smart. Like, I've used it to write some documentation and tutorials, and I'll be writing about a specific model, and I'll be writing text in a markdown file, and I'll start to say, now we need to, and it'll finish the sentence for me. And I'm like, how did it? And it uses, like, I'm writing a pizza form, and it's like, add a form to save the pizzas or something. It's just kind of like, okay, thank you.
So I'm using IntelliCode in Visual Studio because it's there by default, and it's already super useful. Like auto-completing the line or the loop, just because I typed the beginning of variable, it knows what I want to do with a variable. So that's already super useful, I think.
Yeah, it seems like there's kind of like a optimal thing where they kind of work together. IntelliCode is really smart, and I do like that you can also have it read through specific through a model or through a project. So say, for instance, I'm working on a large code base that I haven't worked, that somebody else wrote or a big team wrote. I can say, analyze this, and then it'll give suggestions based on the coding style that they use, which is pretty nice. Copilot is based on huge model coming from the entire, they scan tons of public repos. And so some of the places, like I mentioned, finishing sentences, but some other things are things like obvious things like writing to a file or parsing something using a regex, and it'll say, oh, okay, well, your variable name is email or, whatever, and it'll start to kind of parse things out for me. So that's kind of neat stuff. Okay, just a few more. .NET 5 reaching End of support May 8, 2022. So coming up very soon. For some people, this kind of shouldn't be a surprise because we've been using this support lifecycle for a while. But then for other people it is. So this is just a public announcement about this. And so .NET 6 is the LTS version. So .NET 3.1 was the previous LTS, and now .NET 6 is the current LTS. So if you want to stay in active support, you need to update to .NET 6. And there's a support policy page that kind of explains how things work, what's covered, what support means and what it doesn't. And then there's also a nice pretty graph here. So this is the published, these are the dates when things are going to be released. And what being not current or not in LTS means you stop receiving patches after this 18-month period. And also, like if you want to file a support ticket with Microsoft, they don't support things that are not in support. There's extended support and some kind of weird things in there too. But for the most part, you want to get on the LTS version. So yeah, good.
There is a project I didn't see on your list. I'm sad.
What's that?
Do you know Atif Aziz? I think he created. So he made a project called DocOpt, DOCOPT, and it's not in the list.
He should be in the list. I actually retweeted it and I chatted him
next week
about this. Let me look his up.
If you just Google DocOpt GitHub, you will find the project.
Yeah, so there is that, but they actually just had a release. DocOpt
GitHub.
They just had a release that they tweeted about, which is kind of neat. And it's DocOpt, and they have a .NET one, a .NET thing right here.
Exactly.
Yeah. So what's cool? Yeah. So some neat things, and you can jump into because you have some background here. But basically, you write your DocOpt is based on writing your CLI documentation in a text file. Right. So you write things using this sort of like it's a string, and you write out your information, and then it will build your CLI stuff based on that. So you can say -h or -- version or whatever, and it'll give you that. And the neat thing that they just released, I believe, is they're also using source generators for this, which is pretty neat. So I'm a huge fan of the source generators, and so this they're building this stuff using source generators. And the neat thing with source generators is that it happens at build time, so you're not dealing with reflection or anything. It's optimized code.
It's faster on startup.
Yeah, exactly. Faster on startup, and I guess it could probably like less allocation and all that kind of stuff too. So
probably because less reflection, and it knows what it needs to parse exactly, so it's better in every way. Also for native AOT, it's compatible with native AOT by default. So just good things. And look at that, how polished is it? They have a website. It's so nice, documentation and everything. It's typical from Atif, I'd say, like perfect, super neat.
It's very nice, and this is neat too, showing how like very little work is required to actually do it. So there's different like styles or ways of building CLIs or system command line, and then there's what is it, like dragon fruit or things that are built on it. And that is based more on use attributes to define things in your methods, and it's going to go through and build. This is kind of a nice style where you just write a big string and you know exactly what your help is going to look like, right?
We could have a conference just with a command line parser in .NET. It's crazy the amount of possibilities that there are. So the system.command line is the one that is currently the recommended solution in .NET by the .NET runtime team, and the one that is used in the .NET CLI and all the tools we're using. I just talked to Adam Sitnik this morning, And apparently he made some perf improvements on system command line that will improve the startup also with that. And system command line has lots of options and tooling like autocomplete on the command line, the dragon fruit stuff. They have so many options. One I was using before system command line is the one from Nate McMaster, who used to work in the ASP.NET team. It's called McMaster command line or something like that. Super useful, super great. There are tons of solutions.
So you mentioned system command line, and that kind of takes us full circle back to our first link. And so this one, going through the source here, so he's using with system command line, you can see here he's got a root command, and that adds all these things. So here he creates options, and then he says add OS option. So this is, instead of like the doc-op style, you're writing a kind of a text string. Here you're writing, you're defining things kind of more in source code and as methods, and then you're saying add them. So that's kind of it's a different style, and then it comes down to which is more useful to you and which kind of is easier to maintain long term and that sort of thing. But yeah, I do feel like things have changed over time. There was one from the Mono project that they used for a while. There's a lot of different ones. It does feel like we've kind of standardized on a few, and they've matured quite a bit. It was also frustrating for a while that the .NET team didn't have an official command line parser or anything. And so now this is nice at least to have, like, from Microsoft, a supported system of command line as well.
But people will complain that, Microsoft is killing open source projects.
But then we're right back to here with this Docker. This one,
it's a NuGet package. It's not like in the framework, so anyone can point to anything they want. It's just one more solution.
Exactly. Cool. All right. Well, that is it for me. I will turn it over to you. Should I share your screen, or?
You can share my screen.
Let's do that. Okay. And
everything is public. It's so public that I already opened a GitHub issue just because I don't have slide. I'm sorry. I could have copied a slide from some other presentation, but I'm like, let's open the issue. This issue was opened 2 years ago, 1.5 years ago. But it was some idea that was in our minds for a long time, since almost the first version of .NET. In .NET 6 and before, we have a feature called response caching, which is super useful and is based on all the standards around managing cache from a headers perspective, from a specs perspective, HTTP specification perspective. The only issue with this middleware is that it's not really configurable because it's really linked very, very precisely to the specification and will be driven by headers. So it will react to client headers and server-side headers. And based on that, it will decide to cache or to respond or to send a cached response to the client. So that's what it does, and it's super useful for that. But people have complained that they can't configure the way they want or store the cache somewhere else than memory, or disable caching if the cache header is present, or cache even if the cache header is not present, things like this. And this is something that is actually used a lot in reverse proxies, edge proxies. That's why YARP is mentioned here. For instance, I know lots of people use Nginx just to be able to cache their application and to make it faster. So Nginx can be used just as a proxy, but it's super useful if you use it as a caching proxy, such that, for instance, let's say you have WordPress, and WordPress is super slow if you don't cache anything, then you put Nginx in front of it, and then magically everything is faster because all the requests to your blog posts are just cached and not reprocessed by WordPress. So it's preventing all the CPU to be used, all the database access to be used, and so on. So that's why it's very powerful in a proxy situation, because you don't have to change your app. You can have it as a front end of your app. So it's pretty useful for that.
So there's a few different kinds of caches in an application. You can have like a data cache where you're just like when you do some computation, you get some information together, you store it away, and then when you render the page or whatever, you just read from that data. You're talking here about output caching, where you're caching the output. So that's like basically HTML at that point, right?
Exactly. Yeah, that's the ultimate layer of caching that you can have at the edge level of your application. And it doesn't prevent you from still doing lots of caches intermediately, like database, computing, even pieces of HTML, like fragments, all the things, business logic, all the caches you could have are still valid. And then in the end, if you know that the output of a page, of a web application is the same all the time when you request a specific resource, like by URL, by headers, then you can say, okay, let's cache the whole thing in the end. But when the cache is clear, then you will have a new actual fresh request. You might still want to reuse the database list that is still in memory, and that you will still not process the database access. So yeah, but this is output caching, so it's the last layer of cache you can have from your web app.
And in a lot of applications, you end up using both. Like I know on the .NET website we work on, and we use like services will have caches for data, and then on some of the pages we use like the output cache tag, or the cache tag
cache tag helper. Yeah, I made it.
Thank you very much. I like it. There was a problem I needed to solve, and it was getting complicated. And then all of a sudden, it was like, oh, I could just use the cache tag helper, and the problem, it was done in minutes, and everything worked beautifully. So.
There's actually a feature in the cache tag helper that nobody knows about.
Which one's that?
How do I describe that? The fact that if a cache tag helper is actually also rendering some cache tag helpers from another thing, for instance, from another view, another partial, all the dependency, the cache dependencies of the inner one are inherited to the main one, such that if some of your things that you're rendering are themselves invalidated, you are invalidated, so you will be re-rendered. Okay, because imagine you imagine like on this page, you want to cache the full thing here. Okay, so you have a cache tag helper around that, but this one already has a cache tag helper, and the summary changed because you didn't see anything change. You will still render everything, so this one won't be updated. But with this feature, anything that invalidates this part will also invalidate anything that rendered this thing. So it's like, so inheriting all the tokens, and that's a feature of the cache tag helper, and actually from the iMemory cache to inherit that. That was made just specifically for these kind of things. So that's super useful. But
so kind of related to that, maybe, I don't know. Here's a live question. We've got another Sebastien asking, how would you deal with caching with an authenticated user request?
Yeah. So that's one of the things also that response caching was not letting you change, because anything that is authenticated, anything that is that creates a cookie, for instance, also will not be cached by default with response caching for security reasons. And people ask for that. So if I look at this issue, you will see like, oh, we can't do vary by custom. What if I don't want the no cache header? I want better cookie handling because the current default logic is not what I want. What else? Actually, user operations of cache responses. I'm not sure that's that. Response caching of authenticated requests. All these issues that are gravitating around the response caching, and then so more. This is something that you wanted to handle with output caching also. So yes, sometimes you want to cache authenticated requests, but knowing that what you will render was originally cached for a specific user or role, so you don't want to spill secrets or private information. So in this case, you know that you are doing that, so you will usually cache things that even if the user is authenticated, you know there is no private information, so you can do that. So in the cache tag helpers, for instance, it's easy to do because it's just a fragment. So even like if you're, for instance, caching a menu, And it's fine because even if the user is authenticated, all the menu is the same for all the users, then that's fine to cache it. But for a full page, it's harder. So what you can do also usually is like cache something completely. But here, you see here, this is there anything related to me? Because I'm not signed in. But usually when you are signed in, there is your information here. So one solution is to have this as a separate frame, let's say, or a separate Ajax request, such that the first page doesn't contain anything, but it's a subsequent call that is not cached that will retrieve the personal information. So that's how you would do that. But yeah, so the goal of output caching of the new middleware is to be able to handle all these things that people have asked for. Like you see all the comments like, oh, I want to be able to do that, or here is a solution of what I'm doing. I want the same thing with a new output caching module. So yes, we listen, and the goal is to provide all these features here, some of them which I will show right now in the next version of .NET.
Okay.
Okay, demo. I need to switch to Visual Studio. I will go there, here. So here what I have is, it's the branch output caching from the ASP.NET Core repo. So if you want to play with it, it's there. And this is a simple app that creates a new builder, creates a new endpoint, and this endpoint, the home endpoint, will call into gravatar.writegravatar. And what this thing is doing is just rendering some HTML that will display this image here, okay, which is a monster. So I assume everyone knows about Gravatar. I will assume most people know about Gravatar in this room. Globally recognized avatars, and we usually know it based on the pictures that you see in GitHub or any social platform. Based on your email, there is a hash of your email that is sent to an URL of this site, and it renders your image that you can configure, right? That's how it works. But there is a hidden mode in Gravatar that is, when you generate the URL of a hash, you can ask for a type of Gravatar. And the type is either identical, which is a default, the one when it's your own picture, or a monster ID, or a wavatar, or wavatar, I don't know. Monster ID is the one I'm using that would generate a monster. So every time...
Now I'm curious what a wavatar is.
Well, let me show you.
All right. Now I'm going to break your demo.
No, it will work. This is a wavatar. Okay.
All right.
And if I have 5, so that's the idea is that this website here, every time I hit / will generate a gravatar, which is a grid. So it's like a random value every time that I hash. Well, it's not hash already. It's just a grid with no spaces, no dashes, nothing. And I give it as a hash, the size I want and the type I want, and generating it in an image tag. That's why we are seeing the image to the URL that is behind that. And then what time was this page generated at? Okay, so that's what I would do. And I return a 200 by default. So every time I hit a 5 here, I get a new wavatar. And if you look, there is like multiple layers, like a background, and then a shape, then random eyes, random mouth, and they just iterate over random shape, random eyes, random mouth, and so on. Okay, that generates random stuff.
And I forget if you said, I think Gravatar, it was just a community thing or open source or whatever, but I think it was bought by WordPress or something at one point, right?
It's WordPress. So I use Monster. This way we see when it changes instead of just the time when it was generated.
Yeah.
The time is just optional for later, we'll see. But yeah, that is fun. Like we generate random monster, and we can see that every time I hit refresh, I get a new one. Okay, so reprocess on the server side and so on. So now, let's say I want to cache it because I don't want to generate it every time. I mean, I just need a monster. I don't need it to be rendered every time. So to do that, we need to configure output caching. And By that, we need to first inject all the services. So services.add output caching. I'll keep the options for later. And then invoke the middleware, which needs to be before the get. That's very important because the middleware will intercept the response from this endpoint and cache it, or intercept the request and return the cached value. So if we put that after our endpoints, this will never get cached. Okay? So we need to put it before. That's obvious, but that I bet when we see the release, people will be like, hey, why doesn't it work on my thing? And it will happen all the time. So now I saved it and I hit refresh there. I have a new one because it was not in cache before. But if I click refresh, I still don't have it. That's great because this is exactly what it should do. So by default, in this case, we have enabled output caching, but we didn't mention that we wanted to cache this endpoint. To do that, we can call into an extension method on the endpoints that is output cache. I say, I want this endpoint to be cached. I say, and now if I hit F5, or I will click to show you, it's the same response that I'm getting. I'm getting the same monster, which proves that this code is not invoked, because if it was invoked, it will generate a new grid and then generate me a new monster. But no, it doesn't. And by default, this will be cached for 1 minute, I think, in the defaults I have right now. But when it will be published, it will be more than that, I believe. But right now, it's just 1 minute. If we wanted to change the default value of the expiration, this is the default. You see what I'm talking about, the IntelliCode? Okay, good. So here it suggests me from days 1. So I can say from seconds, for instance, 5. I save it. Reload is kicking in. So the app is restarted. So I have a new fresh entries. And now if I refresh, I click, every 5 seconds, I will get a new entry. I'm getting a new entry every 5 seconds because every 5 seconds, the next time it asks for the cache will be taken from memory, but it will say, well, this one is expired now, so you can't use it. So it will go through and invoke the GET request, which will be cached again for the next request. Okay? So that's how it works if you want to change the default, but I won't change it right now. So that's as simple as that. Inject the services, use the middleware, and then mention which endpoints you want to cache.
So that just a small thing, but that's interesting there. You've got a 5-second cache. And I think sometimes people call that like micro caching.
That's my demo. I will show you later.
Okay. It's interesting with those because I was surprised when I first learned about that kind of caching for just a few seconds, but it can make a huge difference.
Yep. Yeah. So even if you want your content to be fresh all the time, what does fresh mean? I mean, if you have a blog post, fresh means month, weeks, whatever. Okay, you don't have to render the same thing again and again, the same content. If you have news site, I mean, the news come every, let's say, 15 seconds. What's your latency to provide the news, or what's your latency that you want to see the news? Like, let's say there is a headline, like something happened. If you know it like in 10 seconds after or 1 minute after, what is the latency? You are fine with that. Imagine, okay, 5 seconds latency for the big headline. Like the editor saves the file on the website and all the users should see it 5 seconds after. Then you can cache everything for 5 seconds, and that's still super fresh, right? So even if, and when you have a big load of requests, that can save you so many resources, even for 5 seconds, even for 1 second, even for 50 milliseconds. It depends on your traffic. Like if you have 1,000 requests per second, just having the cache for 1 second saves you 99.9% of the traffic, right? So I'm sure my math is correct there. Someone will correct me.
So it kind of kind of stepping back a level, but like, what type of output should we cache? What do you think about caching? I mean, on the one hand, I kind of feel like cache almost everything that doesn't change. Or
I would understand this question about like, is it my? So there are so many things to think about. For instance, should my web APIs be cached? The thing that drives my services. Should my static files be cached? with the output cache? Should my static content, like blog post, be cached? That's how I will understand that, because I have an answer for that. Well, I have an answer. It's all depending on you. Some APIs, for instance, might be cached because their resource only depends on the query, the path, the host, and the parameter on the get. And then you will be like, sure, if you send an API to weather/Bellevue/ the day of today, then yeah, that's the same. I mean, you can cache it for 10 seconds because it won't change in the next 10 seconds. If it's a post, for instance, a post that creates a resource, you probably don't want to cache it because every post should create a resource, unless it's idempotent, meaning that if you send a post with the same information and identifiable resource, then you usually want to return the same thing which is created, even though it was not done the second time, but it was done the first time. And that's what you would do even without caching, which is return the same result for all the posts on the same resource. So caching will still be fine even on post requests. Static files, maybe because a static file is static, so you assume that the response will be the same. However, and what it will save you is a read from the disk. So you read from memory if you store your cache in memory. Okay, so that's some things. And the question could be also understood by, do you cache get command, put command, head command, post commands? Do you cache authenticated stuff? So what do you cache? It's up to you. And the idea is that with this API, it's to provide you with sensible defaults, but to let you customize each endpoint or each section of your site with different caching logic or configuration.
There's just because it kind of fits with what you're talking about a little for me, they're asking, can you output cache with Azure Functions? So that's actually interesting because with the isolated mode of Azure Functions now with V4, I was going to say no, but I think actually you might be able to, because with isolated mode Azure Functions, it basically can run ASP.NET Core middleware. So
I have no idea.
That's an interesting thing. I would have to test this out. I was going to say no, because the way we do this for things I've worked with, including like on the .NET website, we have timers that run every half hour and they write to blob storage. And then the get method of the API I call just reads from the file. And one thing that's nice with that is we also have a post function, and the post will say update immediately or flush immediately. And so, but any GET request is always just reading from storage. So it's really fast. But now actually, this is making me think, I think your middleware that you're talking about right here could potentially be used in an Azure function. So
I know. Maybe you can also use an Azure service already, like Azure, what is that, Edge whatever, or HCDN can do that.
Yeah,
you will not do that on Azure Functions, but yeah, that's.
And Azure Functions can also use, there's the Redis cache, there's a cache service. So,
okay.
Yeah.
I see comments but I will talk about it later during the presentation. But I see good comments, good questions. So if I forget, remind me. I see Per Christensen asking about what if two requests arrive at the same time. I see also mention of Mcached. We'll see later, but I will mention that during my demo.
So if you see, by the way, but since we're using StreamYard, we can star comments now. So I just marked that one as starred, and so it's bookmarked.
But I won't see everything, so then people will be like, "Why didn't you star one?" And so here, the default is when you enable the thing, it's not cached. You have to opt in for that. There is another option, which is that you might want to have everything cached by default, so you don't need to configure anything. Okay. So let's say I remove that and I want everything to be cached by default. In that case, what we can do is add custom policies. So how the output caching is designed is that there is a set of policies that you can set that will change the configuration of how to cache things, how to serve cached entries, how to ignore cached entries for specific per request. And each policy will add some kind of predefined logic. The enable caching policy is a policy that enables the cache for the current request. That says, yes, we can cache this thing. So when we do .output cache, this is exactly what it's doing. It's actually adding the enable caching policy for the current request, for this current endpoint. By doing that as a global policy, it will be done by default for all endpoints. So if I save it and I start again, now it's cached, okay? Even though I didn't say anything. And if I were to add another endpoint, cache, and I refresh, so new one because the app restarted, and I go to /a, I get another one, but if I refresh, I get the same one. So now cache is enabled for everything, endpoints, MVC actions, every middleware responses, static pages, everything. That might be not what you want, so that's why it's not enabled by default. Something else we can see here is that based on the query string, based on the path in the query string, we have a different content. Okay? And that's the logic for the by default on the cache key, the uniqueness of the cache entry. It is based on the scheme, the domain, not the port, I don't think the port, maybe the port, I don't remember, the path and the query string. So anything that changes, so for instance, this is a home page, right, for 1 minute. If I decide to add a query string like UTM equals 1, I get a new entry. If I do UTM equals 2, I get another entry, okay? So that's important to note that everything in the URL will change the cache entry. Not the order of the query strings, but the content of the query string, okay? And we'll see the implication later and how to change that. So here, I showed how to have it enabled by default, but that's maybe not what you want. So I keep it this way. Something that you mentioned earlier is when you want to use micro caching. So on top of policies, what you can do with this middleware is define a profile. Because when you want to set policies, you might not want to redefine the same policies over and over again for each endpoint. So what you want to do, oh, no, sorry, what I wanted to show before, talking about policy for each endpoint, is let's say I want to change this endpoint.
You can override that then.
Yes. So here, well, I want to see because it's a context. Here, what you can do is enable caching policies and define a custom policy for this one, which is, for instance, the no store policy. So no store will add a no store policies to the policies of this endpoint only, not this one. So if I save that, so I refresh, what page am I on? The home page. So this one is cached. But if I go to A and I refresh, this one is not cached. Okay, so you can override using this extension method with custom policies, and there are lots of them that we'll see during this demo. So in case you don't want to write again and again the same policies like this, you can create a profile. So in this case, I'm creating a micro profile, which uses a policy builder that say .expire. So the policy builder is what you get when you do .output cache here. So it lets you configure policies with a Fluent API instead of saying, you could say new expiration policy and pass a value and so on. But expires a value, we just create an expiration policy. It's a Fluent API for that. So here I say micro cache is from second 1 build, and I set it as a profile micro. So now what we can do is, I can do profile and say that this one add output cache, and I can say I use X profile micro. Okay, I'll save it. So this one is not cached. Cache it. So I'm on the A page. So the home page is not cached anymore because I removed the default policy here, enable policy, and /profile, refresh, and you see every second I'm getting a new entry as I click. I hope you see me clicking, click, 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 and I see a new entry every second, because this one is micro, which is 1 second. And if you want to do another one like minute, this is why you will do different profiles, because you might want different part of the site with different expiration time or different verbs, methods that are accepted, and so on. So here, so up to you then to use min. And so what's interesting there is that if you use an app made in MVC, for instance, I think I have it there open. Where is my MVC app? This one. This one here. Controller. So this is an MVC app, and how you will use it in MVC on Razor is using an attribute, okay, on the action. So here from there you can say duration, which is super common, but you could also say profile, for instance.
So this is integrated in with all those profiles that you build in the middleware configuration.
So that's how you will do that, right? Instead of setting all the parameters, you would say, no, this one is profile micro. So this is easier to maintain that, having to redefine everything. So that's just to show you that it also works in MVC, the same logic, okay? It's just the middleware will work with everything that is behind that.
So we talked earlier about like the cache tag helper. Would it also integrate with that, or is that a separate thing?
It's completely separate.
Okay.
There is absolutely no relationship between the two of them.
Okay.
Even their stores are different, and the requirements for the stores are different. You will see. It's easier to do a store for a cache tag helper. Actually, I'm not even sure. Yes, you can configure stores for distributed cache tag helpers because they are based on the iDistributed cache service. So you can implement your custom iDistributed cache service and have a custom one for cache tag helpers, distributed cache tag helpers.
Okay.
So another way to define the profile, if you don't like extension method, you can define an attribute, the same as in MVC, I just showed you, directly on your endpoint. That's a new feature, I think, in .NET 6. That you can, yeah, because minimal APIs is also there. So yeah, so that's you can define an attribute. In this case, you need a lambda. You can't provide an attribute on a static call here. So you need a lambda, and then, yeah. So that's exactly the same thing that will happen, okay? If I save it, this is 1 second and 5 seconds. So I have profile, 1 second. Is it 1 second? Oh, it's both mini. Okay, so the same thing, but attribute, we use the attribute. So that's easy to understand. The thing I want to show is how we can change the query string variation. So if I go on the home page, which is not cached, so wow, something is slower now. What's happening? Everything is super slow. Okay, maybe the network. Let's see. So if I go on I will cache my home page. Because I want to use it. I will refresh the home page. So if I refresh, it's cached. But if I put a query string, we saw that, like UPM, let's use culture equal. I have a new one. I use culture English. I have a new one. Good. But if I do culture English and let's say UTM equals 1, I have a new one. And UTM is the marketing tag, okay, from the old Google Analytics name. And you can see it often because when you click links from promotions, from ads, they will put a value here just to identify where you are coming from, what social ad you are coming from. So as a web server, when you render that, you might not want to render something different. It's just for the JavaScript analytics to track where you're coming from. So what you want to do?
Trivia thing, I think UTM comes from Urchin Tracker.
Yeah.
And Urchin was a company that Google bought that did analytics.
That one. This is Google Analytics. So Urchin Tracker was the Google Analytics, but they rebranded it to Google Analytics. And they bought it in the updates. It's still UTM. It's crazy, right? So, but you don't want to generate something different. But here, what it will do is that for every value of UTM, there is a new cache entry. So it will get a new cache entry. And that's bad because you could even fill the cache with lots of crap because you don't care about it. So what you want to do here in this case is configure an endpoint to say, don't vary by anything else than culture. So here, if I create a query endpoint, output cache vary by query culture, it will stop the cache from varying from everything and just vary by the culture. Okay, what's happening is that internet lags. Okay, but you didn't see it, I felt it. I will have to take away my I don't want to go into details, but I might have to later. So culture. So here, if I save it and I go to query, yes, query here. This one, what's happening? Query. Oh, I maybe didn't save. Yeah, query. Okay. Refresh is the same page. Okay, culture, English, a different page. French, French, a different page. But now if I do UTM equals 1, no, same page. UTM equals 2, same page.
So you've told it there what if you want to do multiple query? Can you?
You can say culture and, for instance, color.
Okay.
So that's and by doing that, it will remove the star mapping because actually by default there is one which is star that says vary by everything. And if you say culture, you say, okay, I don't vary by everything. I vary by that. Okay. So and that could also be a profile in the profile for something because it's just yet another profile that is behind that. So that's the idea to do that. Something else you might want to do when you vary stuff is to vary by a custom value. So the idea is that for a user, by instance, you might want to vary based on the authenticated user value, okay? Or you might want to vary by the day of the week because every day you want something else, but you still want to cache the thing from last day. In my example here, I want to vary by the modulo 2 seconds, which is that every 2 seconds I will have a different value, which will be 0 or 1, 0 or 1, 0 or 1. And I call it time. You don't have to provide a key value. You can just provide a value if you want. But key value is better to prevent collisions. Because maybe if you do 2 different values, would have the same value and then they will collide. So it's better to have a key in this case. So here, what it's doing is that vary by value, I call time, and I say this is the value to vary by. So whenever this thing has a new value, you get a new cache entry. In this case, I can only have 2 values, which is 0 or 1, and this thing will change every second. Okay, so if I run this page then, and you can imagine all kinds of usage from that, like A/B testing or stuff. So here, if I refresh, every second, I'm getting a new value, but not exactly a new value. I'm getting a different value because I have exactly 2 values for this URL. It's just that 0 or 1 on top of the T. Okay, so that's how you vary by custom values. For instance, username. Like you could use the username of the currently logged user to vary the cache, and this way every user has their own cache. And that will also solve the issue with authenticated cache. So you can still cache stuff that is authenticated, also as long as you have one entry per user. This way you are sure that for this user, you are not leaking value from another user. Okay? That's more stuff in the cache, but that's up to you to decide that it's worth it, or because your cache is limited and you never have like more than, I don't know, 1,000 users at the same time. So that's not an issue in terms of perf. So that's something that you can totally do, and that is recommended. Now, answering the previous question that you started, I'm assuming, which is about what's happening when you have. Yeah, I will talk about that right now. What's happening if you have multiple requests going on the same at the same time? Example. Some blank space. Example here. So it's called locking. This feature is called locking. So what's happening is, I'm missing a variable. It's here. So in this lock endpoint, I'm waiting for 1 second, and then I write plus plus on the request, which will be 1, 2, 3, 4, 5. Okay, every time I refresh that, it's not cached. So if I run that and I go and request, there is no more grammar, I'm sorry, 1. And you see every time it takes 1 second to render. Okay, that's expected. Which means I will hit F5 twice, F5, F5. I'm just getting the second request because the first one was stopped by Chrome, and the second one is 6. If I hit now 3 times in 1 second, I'm getting 9. Okay, so what's happening is that by default, when you run 3 requests at the same time on the same resource, even if it's longer, then it will return a new response. Now, if I cache it, by default, because it is cached, the middleware will also lock the query. And look at what's happening. So the first one will be 0, and I will hit F5 3 times. 1, 2, 3. I got 0 every time, so that's bad. Well, that's good because it was cached, but that's not what I wanted to show. What I wanted to show is if I what did I want to show? Oh no, okay, sorry. Expire. Time span, yeah, because it was cached, so I'm not seeing the thing. I don't want it to be cached. From milliseconds. We'll cache it for 1 millisecond, okay? And because I don't type fast enough, a second request won't be cached, so it will process it again. Okay, so let's try again. 0 the first time. So a reminder, it's cached for 1 millisecond. So if I click F5 3 times, I will get a new cache entry every time. 1, 2, 3, but it takes 1 second. I'm getting 1. I hit 3 times, but I'm getting 1. Because what's happening is that my 3 hits hit the server because the first one is not yet cached. Okay, it takes 1 second, and I send 3 requests. So they are not cached at all. None of them are cached. But what it's doing is that because it's seeing that something is currently processing the same thing that is currently request with the same cache entry, then it will say, wait, I don't need to reprocess that because this one, the first one, will return me a value that will be cached, probably, that I can return to the second and the third one. So let's wait and not do nothing, wait until the first one is done, and if it's cached, then we can return the cached value, or we can process the entry. Okay, so that's what we call locking, probably because other cache engines call it locking. We might change the name to gating, to whatever, but the idea is that by default, if a resource is cached or marked for being cached, then it will prevent clients from requesting the same thing and prevent actually the server from processing the request from all the clients that request the same thing. That is something that is that can be an issue for lots of websites, and the name behind the issue are either cache stampede or thundering herd. The idea with cache stampede is that it's typical when you have something in cache and you have like thousands of requests per second, and at some point the cache will be expired. And then the next 1,000 of requests or more, if it's take more than 1 second to render, will process the same resource. And the server will get a burst of load just in a snap. So
it kind of overwhelms it. Everything's cached for a while, and then all of a sudden 1,000 people are all requesting the same thing.
Exactly. Same thing on startup. When you start your application, the cache is always fresh. So if your application your server is restarted because something happened, and then the traffic is still going on, right? And then because there is so much access and nothing is cached, your server goes down again. And then you start it again, but still, because there is lots of pressure, it never can keep up with the pressure, so it goes down again. And that's called the thundering herd also, when you have too much resource that you can't keep up with the request. And that thing prevents that. This can be disabled by endpoint by calling .lock false. So if you really don't want this behavior when you cache something, you can say don't lock the resource. And if I do that, even if it's cached, if I have concurrent 23 requests, they would all be called. Yeah? That's the idea. Well, not all of them, but because there is some caching. Now I have 4, but the first 3, because it was not cached, they got a new thing. So that's the idea of locking. What did I want to say about that? No, I think that's all. But that's super useful when you have lots of concurrent requests, because what's the point of generating the same thing 1,000 times if you know it will be cached and served by the cache later on? There will be, after Preview 4, there will be more features, like to be able to say how long you can wait for something to be cached before returning a stale value, or how long to wait before returning an error, because maybe you are waiting for someone else to render the thing, but this someone else is too slow. So you might want this endpoint to then return an error, or to return a stale value that is not that stale, like 1 second ago. The idea being like the first request generating an entry for an older cache entry, like the cache is there, but it's not fresh anymore. So we need to reprocess it. So the next one will process it. But the ones after, if they see that someone is already processing and the cache entry was not that late, they can be served a stale cache. Okay, but as soon as the new one generated a new value, then everyone else will get the new value. Okay, so that's the idea. You can.
That's one thing I've run into with caching. There's 2 different sides to it. Like, Paris, another question on there. When are items actually removed from the cache? And so on the one hand, you can wait till there's a request that comes in and it sees that the cache is stale and it says time to regenerate. It's also nice if you can get some sort of, like on caching in the past, I've used things with a callback that says when something's kicked out of the cache, that's when I want to regenerate it. So nobody has to wait.
Yeah. So there are lots of ways to handle that. And we don't provide anything by default, but we provide the extensibility to do that. First, by default, what we do is that we don't remove things. We just let them be refreshed, or we let the expiration time do its thing and remove it by itself. So it's based on the store. Like the store might remove it when the expiration is done. If it doesn't remove it, because some stores won't do that, we will read it, but see that it's expired because it has metadata inside the store. So we can know that, oh, the thing that we got from the store is already expired, but the store didn't remove it. So let's not take it. Let's maybe let it die later when the store decides to clear the entries. Another way to expire a thing is to put limits on the store. So there is a default option that we will expect stores to implement, which is size limit. The size limit is for each store to say how many megabytes of data it can store. And the idea is that the store should not store more than that. So we keep the things inside the cache, even if they are not used, even if they are expired. But when there is no more space, it will start editing the old ones. Okay, so it's like a rolling file.
Okay.
Another way to do what you mentioned, which is preemptive caching, is you can create a process or a background task that will continuously hit some endpoints of yours. Like every minute, it can send one request to the service, to the endpoints, or to the 1,000 endpoints, whatever, just to keep the things updated and fresh. such that when an actual client comes with a request, they will get a cached entry directly instead of generating it. And that's up to you to hit all the endpoints you want. And you know there are services online that do that for you. You can just configure online a list of URLs, and they will ping your site continuously on this URL. And that's a way to keep your site up or to keep your pages fresh. Something else we will allow is to be able for you to purge stuff automatically. So let me show you this demo then. And you will see what I mean.
There was a question on that one.
So let's say I have a blog. Okay. I have a blog and a blog post URL with a post ID. And what I want to do is I want to group all my blogs and blog posts with the same cache eviction to purge my blog, because I don't want to purge everything else. I just want to purge my blog because it has been updated and I want to refresh the cache to force it. Because I might cache my blog by 7 days. But when I have updating my blog post, I want everyone to see it now. I don't want them to wait for 7 days. So what you can do is call the tag helper to tag your endpoints with a specific value. So in this case, I will call it blog, but it can be any string. And what's happening is that all the things that are cached for all these endpoints, they are all unique, but they have one thing in common, which is this little tag blog. I'm tagging my blog post. And based on that, we have an API in the store. The store has 3 APIs. Add. That's a good question. Get, set, and evict by tag. That's what an output cache store has. Super simple. And in this case, I'm creating a custom post method with purge and the tag name that will resolve the output cache store and then call evict by tag async on the store. So I'm saying remove every entry that was tagged with blog, for instance. And then I will just refresh my cache just for the blog. If you want to refresh everything, just tag everything with the same tag. That's how we will do that. So here, if I go on my blog, I have a gravatar and it's cached. Okay. If I go on my blog post 1, I have a gravatar and it's cached. Now, if I call into, I should have opened that before, sorry, but I forgot in some. Oops, a second. This one. So if I go there, here I have the good thing here. Purge log, I will send that as a post. It says okay, and if I refresh my post, why don't I see the? I have a new one. Okay, so if I refresh here, same one. I send a purge. I refresh. I have a new one. And same thing for the post. So by calling evict by its, so it's up to you to expose whatever ways you want to evict something. And it can even be your own background task and not an endpoint. This one could be protected by authentication, for instance, or by geolocalization. Like only this IP can evict something. Okay. So that's how you would do that.
So, and your comment there says you used a post so that the endpoint's not cached.
True. That's a good comment. I should have read it. Yeah, so in this case, what's happening is that when we define output caching, in the policies, there is a default policy. What does the default policy do? Default output cache policy. So this is what is added as a policy by default if you do nothing. It says vary everything by query string. It says you are looking for the things, you can store things, you can answer, cache, and you can only cache, this is this entry, attempt response caching. You can only cache if the request is a get or a head, if the user is not authenticated. That's the default policy. And if you don't like it, you go there, you call options.policies.clear, and you add your own custom policy that will do something like this. Define what is cached, what is not cached, and so on. Okay. You can even say, even without clearing, you can add another policy that will just say if is post return true, and then it will work. That's the idea later on. So you can override any decision that was made by a different policy than yours in your own policy by adding it at the end of the list of policies, or even by an endpoint. There is even
I was going to say, you could just say don't cache the purge tag endpoint as well, right?
Oh yeah, yeah, correctly. Yeah, you're right. Map post.output cache.no store or something like that. You could say don't. Yeah. Well, yeah, and well, actually, yeah, it's not about post. It's not cached because there is no .output cache. But when I wrote the comment, it was cached by default, so that's why.
Got it.
Okay. Post was there. So that's the
idea. Question here about headers. So, for instance, can you skip caching based on like a bearer token in the header?
Yeah. Actually, the thing I showed you here, you see? Well, this is authorization, but you could say, in this case, if the current request has this header, then return false. Don't cache that. And that could be your own policy to do that. Let me show you what the policy
is. And that's the default. So by default, if there's an authentication header, but then you could override that if you wanted to.
Yeah. Then something I will show you after, because it's related to headers, is remember when we talked at the beginning about response caching, that it was based on conventions and specification? Well, you can actually write the specification as a policy. So what we did as, I don't know which one I want. One will not work, one will work. Because they have the same name, but they have different namespaces. So what's happening here is that the headers endpoint, I'm caching it with the response caching policy. So this policy is actually a copy of the response caching logic in the Output Caching, which is the same as before, but here is response cacheable. You can only cache if there is these headers, public string. You can't cache if there is a no store string. All these things that are actually from the response caching logic. These are in this policy. So if you want the response caching logic for a specific endpoints, like to drive it by headers, you can do that. So in this case, what I'm saying is that the server sets the cache control header for the client to say public string. And the middleware with this policy will say, hey, this entry can be cached because it has the header. So let's cache it. So let me try that. If I go to headers, and you will see how I love this thing. Headers, I have to wait for it to be ready. Or maybe it didn't build. No, it's fine. So let's try again. Headers, save. Okay, now it's working. So I'm just displaying the date. It's not rendering the Gravatar, sorry, but you see it's actualizing. So it should be cached, but it's not cached. Why isn't it cached? Because actually, if you go in the DevTools and you go to the network tab here, and I hit refresh, and I look at the request, and I look at the headers, the request header contains cache control max age 0. So Edge asked, no, I want a fresh value. I don't want your cache stuff. Give me something fresh because I hit F5. Okay, because you hit F5, it's actually adding that. And this guy, this policy, is actually following the spec. It says, no, if there is a no cache header, max age 0, I won't render anything that is cached. So what we can do in this case is take that URL, which is /headers, in this thing. So I will do a get on /headers.
And but this here, won't apply that.
I don't have the headers here. I don't have this header. So I will send, and here, you see, I'm getting the same value again and again. So this is cached. So this is working. Because I'm not saying I don't want a fresh value, it's working. And that's also why the response caching didn't suit most of the needs, because all the Chrome requests, all the Edge requests will return will ask for match H0. So it's invalidating your cache all the time. So there is no point in caching web traffic if it's not an API, for instance. For APIs, it's fine, it will not send it. But for web traffic like this from browsers, you will not be able to cache anything. So that was not suiting the needs for most of the users who want to cache CMS or static sites or stuff like this. Okay. So that's a way to provide more features as a policy.
So interesting question that's come up in here is, so I know this is for .NET 7. Is it possible to use this? Is this something that can be used in .NET 6, or does it require .NET 7 completely?
You can copy paste the code as is right now, create a package, as long as you follow the license, which is you can copy it as long as you copy paste the license. That's what MIT says.
Okay. So it's not like published as a separate NuGet package or something
no,
like that.
No, it will be in the runtime framework and in .NET 7 only. But we won't go backport it to 6.0. There is no reason. It's a new feature. There is one thing that is not available before 6.0. Yes, it is available. As long as endpoint routing is there, you can even do that for MVC. So yeah, there is nothing special to .NET 6 here.
Okay.
Absolutely nothing. It's just endpoint routing that is required in this case, but you can still do profiles and use MVC also. So that's totally fine. No, yeah. So that, I have 2 last demos, very related, so they should be quick. One is something that lots of people should be aware of, is an e-tag. So the idea with e-tag is when you render a resource, you can give it an identifier, e-tag. Okay, I'm using a quid in this case, and set it as a header. So you're telling the client, the browser, that the thing that you rendered is the resource named with the e-tag, such that the next time it will request the same page, it will send to the server, hey, the last time I got it, it was this value for this page. So if you don't have a new value, just tell me with a 3 or 4, and don't send me a response because I already have it. So that's good for perf because the server doesn't have to send the page, the content of the page. It will just tell the client, what you have is already the same thing as I would send you. So I'm not sending it to you. Keep it the same thing, okay? So that's super common. So here, how do you do that? It's just on your server side, you will set an e-tag value. That's how you would do. E-tag values, be careful, they need double quotes. I experienced the pain of not setting the double quotes. It didn't work, so now I know it's double quotes for my life, forever. So that, and it's called, so it's output cache, it's called e-tag, and I will do that using my Insomnia browser here. So if I go e-tag, saying hello, okay, but what also is important is that, okay, I'm waiting for internet to come back. Here it says the e-tag for this content is that. So now if I
do set, weird that it requires those quotes, because nothing.
It's because there are other kind of values that you can pass. You can pass w/something, you can pass star, you can pass a list of values. There are many things you can pass. So that's why it's encoding it this way.
Got it.
Yeah.
And I had to look it up because I was curious. E stands for entity. So it's an entity tag.
Entity tag, yeah. So if none, there is a match, okay, that is sincere, value that. And now I say, give me that page, but only if it's not that value, okay? And if it's cached with that value, okay? So if I don't set it again, okay, I will copy that here. If I will remove that. If I send again, remove it, send again, it's the same value because it's cached, okay? So it's the same value because the middleware will cache also the tag. So here, if not match that, I send, I'm getting a 3 or 4 not modified. I'm not getting the content anymore. I'm just getting a code saying what you have is exactly what you should have had. So that's good. I don't give you the content. So that's an optimization that is super useful for websites. Another one that is implemented is the if modified since. So the idea is that here, it was generated at this time. So instead of if not match, you ask for if modified since, and you paste that here. Put it bigger. Can I? Yeah. So only if it's modified after that date. And if I send, no, I have a 3 or 4 also. But if I say if it was modified after that, same thing. I should have, oh no, this one up there, because the content I have, well, modified since, oh yes, it's 2020. I'm confused. So no, this one is fine. 200. Oh no, because it's 2020, and I said modified since 18, so I should have 2020 here. 2020, send is the same thing. 2021, send is the same thing. Okay, so this one works now. So because I say the content I have is from this date, so give it to me only if your content is older than that. And he says, no, it's the same date, but I have in cache. So 3 or 4. I'm not sending you the same content. So if modified since is also working as expected. And that's all the demo I have. Now, let's see if you have more questions.
Yeah, there are a few. Let me see. There's a few on like caching in a distributed infrastructure, and you know that brings up too. You mentioned several times like the store. Is this in memory? Can you use other stores?
Yeah, so that was a limitation of the response caching. There was only memory. So here by default, it's using the memory also, but it's abstracted and specifically for the output cache. So you don't have to change one to change everything. You can just change this one. You just provide an implementation of output cache store. So this one is the memory output cache store, which is using a iMemory cache and a dictionary for the tags. But the idea is that what we will do for Net7 is at least another implementation, which will probably be the disk, the file system, such that the entries are stored on the file system and not in memory, so you don't use all the memory that it can take. Another one that will be next in line will be the Redis implementation, because you might want to share the same cache across nodes. And then it's up to you to implement all the things you think about, like SQL Server. Something that will be interesting also is a tiered solution, like that stores in memory the most recently used stuff, but in a backup store like Redis or database or file system, the rest of the thing, such that as long as it's used often, it's in memory. But if it's not used often, we can pick it up from the store and then refresh it in memory for next time. So it's a most recently used list of items in memory and the rest on the disk. So it's just the best of both worlds. It stores a lot, but only a few in memory for the thing that is used a lot.
Okay, cool. Let me see.
And I'm sure people will create NuGet packages that will provide different stores. Like imagine you have a good, like someone mentioned memcached in PHP, that you can do an implementation with memcached. If you are a company that creates a cache engine, then you can create an adapter for this output cache to use your cache engine because it's better.
Got it. Okay, cool. So for something like, it's worth talking about, something like Kubernetes. So let me try and see if I can answer it. You can correct me if I'm wrong here. This is something that will, when you're talking about Kubernetes, you're going to have multiple microservices, different things, and this is going to be in the web tier. So one of your services is going to be your web tier, and that's where you'd implement this.
You could have, what you could do is have your Redis instance configured as the pod, and you could even scale it because you want to scale Redis, I don't know, but it could be configured on your web app to say, use this Redis instance or this Redis shard. And then even if Redis grows or goes down, then it will use Redis as a cache. That's the solution. There is nothing special with Kubernetes in this case. It's just, if you have a distributed store for your cache, then sure, it works with Redis, with Kubernetes. Even if you don't have a distributed store, for instance, if you have everything in memory, you could still scale out all your web tiers, and they will each of them have their own local cache and their own local cache entries. The only risk is that if you don't have session affinity with every pod, then you might be able to serve different cached entries for different requests, but they will be all cached. So it's better in this case to use a distributed one. And that's also related to the micro caching thing. You can imagine that you have in a tiered solution where something is cached in memory and the rest in the disk. In memory, you do a very small amount of seconds cached, okay? such that even if two different nodes respond with the same memory entries with different values, they are just different for 1 second. But if you get a burst, you will get all the same values.
Okay.
So memory is still useful in this case. If it's micro caching memory, it's still useful. And then you can back up to a store with a longer term caching.
Okay. Jose is asking, what about exception caching? I forget if you talked about that.
It's right now, I think the default policy is caching everything. That is, so meaning 200 and non-200s, like 500s, 404s and everything. I don't think I did anything special in this case. So right now it would cache everything. So maybe that's not something you want. So you might want to say, don't cache anything that is not a 200. Or maybe it's doing, I have to check. Maybe it's internally that you can't change it, that it's just caches 200s or 304s. I have to check. But that's a good question. Like if in the case of, is it based on status code or, yeah, because if there is an exception, I mean, the page is a 500, so you will not cache it. So we need to look into how to cache or not cache specific status code. I'm not sure. I handled that right now.
Okay.
Specifically, I have to check.
Just another kind of in general thing I was thinking about, and I'm pasting it in the chat, but just as far as general guidance and stuff. So it is true that what you're showing here is .NET 7. We do have caching guidance for .NET 6, and it also explains some of the terms that you've been talking about, things like in-memory cache and distributed cache and those sorts of things. So, and, partly because, people kind of come and go during the stream and stuff, can you compare, or can you kind of summarize what's different between .NET 6 and .NET 7 as far as your caching options?
I would have explained what's the difference between memory cache and distributed cache.
Okay, go for that.
Memory cache means it's in memory, for sure. Distributed cache doesn't mean it's not in memory. It can be in memory. Distributed cache is serializable data. If you can serialize the cache entry, you can use a distributed cache, and it needs to be serializable because it will be stored out of process. Because it's in memory, you can store live objects, like I can store a J object, I can store an integer, I can store, well, it's serializable. I can store anything. Yeah, I can store a service, an I something, if I want in memory cache. It's just a pointer, it's just a memory reference. In the distributed cache, you can and you should only cache serializable stuff. And if it's serializable, usually you should use a distributed cache because it's better. Then your question was about what's new in .NET 7 about caching. Oh, there will be new stuff. Currently, so there is new stuff. In .NET 7, the memory cache disables the inheritance of tokens I mentioned earlier that is used in the cache tag helpers for performance reasons, because inheriting all these tokens was making things slower. So it has been disabled by default. But when you use cache tag helpers, it's enabled for the memory cache instance that the cache tag helpers is using. So you won't see the difference if you use cache tag helpers because it's using the feature, but it's disabled for the other memory cache by default. So if you are using the feature explicitly, you need to enable it. There is a flag. There is something also new that is currently discussed in the runtime repository as a PR that will be merged very soon. It's ready. It's about getting statistics about the memory cache. So now the memory cache will expose usage statistics like cache hits, cache misses. So there is a new API and a new interface that you can resolve, and you will be able to ask for the iMemory cache instance for its statistics if you want to display them somewhere. And I assume the next step is to have the net counters to be able to expose that.
Okay. So you basically just asked the next question I was going to ask, but in case there's additional answers to it, one of the things that I run into with caching, for instance, when I use a cache tag helper, I write an HTML comment with a timestamp in there about what time the cache was written and what time it will expire, just so that I can troubleshoot it. If I'm troubleshooting something, and sometimes it's easy to make a mistake where why isn't this page updating? Oh, it was cached or whatever. What are the best ways to track? For instance, does anything get written to the console output or anything when a cache is hit?
Yeah,
or
there is logging. If you enable logging for these services with a debug level or trace level, you will see all these things happening, like cached entry was not retrieved from cache or was fresh. And let me show you actually here. You see, if I take the correct one, 102. Oh, can you share my screen?
Yeah.
So here you can see that I enabled the logging here in debug mode, and you can see why it's happening. Like was not refreshed. You see, if modify since specify blah blah, so we could restore it from the cache. So everything is logged in this case for the decision that was taken. So in this case, you will enable logging for this component, output caching middleware, to see what's happening. And all this code actually I almost didn't write anything. It's from the response caching that already had all these nice logging.
Okay. So another thing I do sometimes is in development, I'll disable cache or enable it just in the server. And here you could write that code here.
Yeah, you could do if whatever, enable or disable, or yeah.
Okay.
There could be a policy that is no store, like, oh, let's add options.policies.add new no store policy, and wrap it in if environment dot whatever, no development, or I don't know.
Yeah, I think in environment that is, or yeah, I think it should.
Yeah.
I forget. Okay, one other question before we wrap up here. There was so what you're showing is server-side caching. Is there any kind of relation to how this works with client-side? Like, I guess this still applies to your API calls. So I guess that's kind of the overlap here, right?
Then how can it be a serverless application? If it's a serverless application, then it's all in the client. There is no need for caching, or you use the local client caching. Maybe you can use the local storage for caching.
Yeah, and that reminds me of, for instance, like Steve Sanderson showed a demo where he used SQLite.
Do you want to make all my demos look dirty compared to Steve Sanderson?
This was really good. This was very helpful. So, okay, so I guess as we wrap up, for people that do want to kind of keep up to date as this is being developed, or want to leave any feedback, where's the best place?
The issue I showed earlier, it points to the epic issue, which is.
I think I got that.
So this issue lists all the features we want to implement for Net 7 and the reasons, and that's where I called for feedback about what do you need, what did I miss. Like I took a note about exceptions. What do we do in case of exceptions or messages or status code? So yeah, that's the issue to look into. And Perfect. The ones that are referenced also. So we should ship it in preview 4 as a preview. There might be breaking changes in the next previews, but like API calls, stuff like that. And officially in .NET 7.
Great. Okay. Wow. Okay, this is really useful. As always, I was worried like, oh, this will be a really short show, and we're actually definitely at time, so we should wrap up here. But, thank you. This is really useful.
Thank you.
And yeah. Okay. Let me. Okay. Awesome. Well, I guess we'll wrap up there. Thanks a bunch, Sebastien.
Thank you, everyone. Bye-bye.